Imagine a nation swept up in a frenzy, families rushing to buy homes, convinced that property is the safest bet in the universe. Young couples taking on massive mortgages, retirees gambling their pensions on the sure thing that is real estate, and banks handing out loans like it's candy. This might sound like China during their property bubble, or Japan in the 1980s building the biggest property bubble in history, but I'm actually talking about Sweden. Yes, Sweden, during its biggest property bubble in history in the late 80s. Before diving deeper, I just want to give out a quick disclaimer that I'm half Japanese and half Swedish, and I actually grew up in both countries during the 90s. Hence, some of the things I'm saying are definitely personal bias, how I felt during the time, so it's not a flawless historical record. With that out of the way, let's begin. Chapter 1. Sweden's Bubble, a Mirror of Japan. In the late 80s, Sweden was riding high. Easy credit, deregulated banks, and soaring asset prices. Houses, stocks, and commercial real estate, everyone wanted a piece of the action. Sounds familiar, right? Well, the same euphoria that gripped Japan at this time was now hitting Sweden in full force. And just like any bubble, whether it be Japan's bubble in the 80s, the US bubble in 2008,
what in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Or China's bubble in 2019, nobody thought it was gonna end. They all thought this time it's different. The fundamentals are all different and this can continue forever and ever and ever until it doesn't. By 1992, property values in Sweden plummeted by nearly 30% overnight, wiping out fortunes, leaving families drowning in debt, and pushing banks to the edge of collapse. Sweden's crisis was so dire that the central bank felt forced to raise interest rates at a mind-blowing 500%. Think about that for a moment. 500%. Today, in the US, the Federal Reserve has raised the interest rate to around 4.5%, and people are suffering immensely. Now imagine that times 100. That's what Sweden went through at this time. This almost broke Swedish society as a whole. Businesses, homeowners, and government itself almost stopped functioning. However, today when we're talking about bubbles in history, Japan's bubble is 1,000 times more famous, and you probably haven't even heard about Sweden's bubble. Why is this? Well, first, Sweden is a smaller country, but there's one other thing that makes Japan's bubble so much more famous. Japan never truly recovered. Now 30 years after Japan's bubble burst, we still see the signs everywhere. Stagnant growth, deflation, and a debt ballooning bigger than any other country in the world. Sweden, on the other hand, faced a near total national meltdown, but came back stronger, and eventually ranking among the world's wealthiest nations. So, how did Sweden turn their luck around? How did they recover from this enormous crisis while Japan just kept suffering? Well, let me tell you the story in Chapter 2, Sweden's Hard Reset. When the financial crisis hit Sweden, the right-wing government under Prime Minister Carl Bildt collapsed, paving the way for the Social Democrats, led by Finance Minister and later Prime Minister of Sweden, Göran Persson. Göran Persson was a big, brass, and not very likable guy. Here, you can see him stealing candy from a store in Stockholm. But at this time, he was the right man for the job. He came to power saying it was time to clean up this mess, no matter how painful it would be for the people. And boy, did he deliver on that promise. He slashed spending across the board. Healthcare, welfare, and even reformed the sacred pension system in Sweden massively. But he did not just let the people suffer, he also went after the corporations. While Japan was busy propping up the very corporations and banks that led to the huge bubble in the first place, Göran Persson had a different approach. Let them fail. In a particularly dramatic move, the Swedish government allowed the two biggest banks in Sweden, Nordbanken and Götabank, to collapse completely, forcing these bitter rivals to merge into one bank that now exists as Nordea. In Göran Persson's own words, when the banks pleaded for help, he said, "This is for real. If you mismanage this, you will end in disaster." This time was marred with unemployment and poverty, and the Swedes suffered more than any other time since World War II. But these ruthless measures brought Sweden's deficit to near zero within only 4 years, laying a foundation that Japan never achieved. Just as you could imagine, Persson's approach was politically very costly. His party faced huge backlash publicly, resulting in some of the worst election results in 70 years for the Social Democrats. But he pushed on, emphasizing that this isn't an economic issue, it's a political one. By the late 90s, Sweden's economy had stabilized and growth had returned. Persson's austerity was painful, but it gave Sweden long-term stability, a harsh contrast to Japan's decades of stagnation and reluctance to tackle the core issues directly. Chapter 3: Japan's Missed Chance. The Japanese government in the 90s, just like in Sweden, had a golden opportunity to fix the wrongs they've made in the 80s. But they refused to bite the sour apple. Japan was so blinded by the prosperity that it simply couldn't fathom an end to the good times. Instead of letting the banks and corporations fail, Japan's government bailed them out time and time again, creating the infamous word zombie corporations. These firms weren't allowed to die, but they didn't produce any profits and would collapse without government support. They are zombie corporations, still not allowed to die to this day, roaming the earth without any purpose, costing the Japanese taxpayers millions of dollars every year. By refusing this short-term, painful reset that would clearly increase unemployment rapidly, the Japanese government chose to kick the can down the road, and Japan became stuck in a cycle of stagnation, now known as the Lost Decades. Today, Japan's debt stands at a 270% of its GDP, while Sweden hovers around 35%. Sweden confronted the crisis head-on, and Japan tried to outrun it. And here's the heartbreaking irony in all of this. The world looks at Japan and sees punctual trains, spotless sidewalks, and technological marvels. But beneath this polished surface lies a mountain of debt and an aging society. Meanwhile, Sweden's story underscores a vital truth. A sustainable growth only happens when a nation is willing to face its demons and let the failing structures go. And I can already hear you comment here that Sweden is nowhere near perfect and they have huge issues. And yeah, you are absolutely right. Sweden has massive issues with gun violence and immigration that seemingly just keep getting worse. But the one difference with Japan here is that the Swedish government is healthy. They have a lot of resources at their disposal. Because of how they've handled financial crises in the past and how they're doing right now, they can tackle these issues head on with the resources needed to clean things up and make things better for everyone. The Japanese government, on the other hand, don't have this luxury. Because their decades of mismanagement and kicking the can down the road has made it so that their debt mountain is too high for any substantial reform. In fact, if the government truly tried to make structural reform to fix their wrongs of the past, they could risk bankrupting the whole nation. Chapter 4: Japan's Turnaround? So, could Japan still turn things around? Well, possibly, and there are some signs that the government is trying. However, these signs are not really structural change, but feels more like a band-aid on this gaping wound that is the world's largest debt burden. Japan has started to increase tourism massively, and they aim to hit 60 million people by the end of 2030. That's insane. That's actually gonna be half of the Japanese population in just tourism every year. And I think it's a solution. I mean, Japan desperately needs foreign money, and this definitely gives foreign money. But we'll see how much tourism the Japanese people can handle before they turn against the politicians. And they're slowly increasing immigration to plug the hole of a declining birth rate. But this is not nearly enough to really make a difference in Japan, and the birth rate still remains one of the lowest in the world. But whatever you think about immigration, it's basically a necessity in Japan at this point. There are so many jobs that are not filled because there's just not enough people. Jobs in construction and the service industry that couldn't be possible without immigration at this point. However, the past still haunts Japan every day, and the government is still running massive deficits. And this is the stark difference I really wanted to pinpoint in this video. Sweden took a harsh but decisive route in the early 90s nightmare, while Japan clung to bailouts and half measures. And today, Sweden's economy remains robust, and Japan is still grappling with debt and demographic headwinds. To put it simply, nobody talks about the 90s crisis in Sweden, while everybody talks about the 90s crisis in Japan. And the reason? Sweden solved it, while Japan is still suffering from it. So my dear viewers, I want to leave you with a question. What do you think Japan should do? Should they bite the bullet and let the people suffer now? Possibly much more than Sweden ever did due to all the debt accumulation that's been happening over the 30 years? Or should they take a completely different route? Or maybe they should do nothing and just enjoy the time they have left and sail into the sunset. Please feel free to comment whatever you think, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.